Hi, my name is Tom Rogers, and I'm going to try to launch a podcast on Rumble. And I'm going to try to keep it very brief. This is about what happened when the Houthis in Yemen launched a drone, hit Tel Aviv over the weekend, killed Israeli within 100 yards of the United States consulate there. And in response, the Israelis launched a raid over 1,800 kilometers away to hit the port city of Hodeidah. And this is very, very different than what's going on in Lebanon. Uh, First of all, aid goes in through Hodeidah. That includes fuel. That also includes, unfortunately, weaponry. And the Houthis were obviously not very pleased with this whole thing. And it has a lot of fallout for them. There has been a reaching out of the government, the recognized government in Sana'a, the UN recognized government, and the Houthi rebels in Saudi Arabia, of all places. And the Saudis and the UAE have been basically bombing the living you know what out of them since 2014. And the Houthis have been giving their wrath to Saudi Arabia over this time with drones and missiles. Now, what's interesting about this missile attack and why I don't think that there's going to be a lot of actual oomph behind the leaders bragging, unlike Nasrallah in Lebanon, is because that port itself is the entry point for a lot of equipment for the Houthis. Okay, they obviously have some stuff left over. The Israelis shot down a missile that was headed towards Eilat. And just from someone who was an intelligence analyst in the intelligence section of a Pershing missile battalion in Europe in the 1980s. I also am a former intelligence officer in the United States Army Reserves, and although I never made it beyond captain, junior officer, they teach you to analyze things a few levels above what you actually are serving at. Now, the one thing that I can remember specifically about the Pershing, okay, the Pershing was a intermediate range ballistic missile. The Pershing ones were liquid fueled. Now, they used a much more stable liquid than probably the Houthi missiles are using, and I'll explain that. But what you have to understand about liquid fueled rockets and missiles is it takes a lot longer to get them ready to go. Okay, and again, I'm not talking about drones. That's a whole nother deal. Propeller-driven drones or something like that. That's a whole different thing. Remotely piloted vehicles, etc., etc. But in terms of large missiles that are liquid fueled, which is what they basically have, this is what they've gotten from Iran. This takes time. Okay, it's actually on the pad, or it's on the erector launcher, and it has to be fueled up. And I've seen this because I was a guard when there was a changeover from the Pershing 1 missiles to the Pershing 2 missiles. I served in the 33rd Field Artillery Brigade in a town called Neu Ulm, which is on the Danube River, right across from the major German city of Ulm. And anyway, our combat alert site was out in the Black Forest. That's where all of our nukes were. And they were converting all the batteries in the 1st of the 81st over to the Pershing II. And the Pershing II was a solid fuel. Now, the advantage of solid fuel is it's much quicker to set this up. You need fewer cables. You need fewer crewmen. I do not remember exactly how many, but a Pershing I missile basically required a crew of 30 plus very skilled crewmen. Maybe it was 35. We called them cable humpers. These were the guys who would attach the electric cables, fuel it up, and all of that. And it would basically take 45 minutes on the pad. And we actually had launch pads there at our combat alert site. Now this could be done out in the field. It could be done in an area where there are actual launch pads for this kind of thing. So anyway, I saw them fueling these things up, practicing, getting ready to launch them. I never actually saw the I have seen some of these missiles, the solid fuel, but I have never actually seen them out in the field being practiced to get them to launch. If the Soviet satellites had went over and actually saw a Pershing missile with a nuclear warhead or a training warhead on it, that would have been considered an act of war. And that just wasn't done. So their training was either on the combat alert site, and they only went through having the missile itself, which in this case was the Pershing I's, and they were not erected. They were in a horizontal position, so that a satellite Soviet satellite could go over and see that, okay, they're not going to nuke us, etc., etc. And that was also the case with the Pershing IIs, until they built actual large buildings where they could erect these things in. They actually were using beer tents, which was very funny. But anyway, to try to get away from the issue of the difference between a fueled system and something like a solid fueled system, and why it's much easier for the Israelis to detect. And the Israelis, trust me, they have satellites, and they have access to the United States' spy satellites. Okay, North Korea supposedly was basically there is a technological sharing between Iran and North Korea. And about 6 years ago, intelligence analysts were starting to suspect that the North Koreans were using something which was called the devil's venom, because the former Soviet Union had tried to use it in its R-16 ICBMs back in the early 60s, late 50s, early 60s, with disastrous results. As a matter of fact, on the 24th of October 1960, there was a huge explosion, and this was classified at the highest levels in the Soviet Union. This was at the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. And basically this fuel, and I'm not a chemist, so I'm not going to bore you with this too much, but the devil's venom is something called hypergolic UDMH nitric acid. That is hypergolic UDMH nitric acid. This is highly flammable, very flammable stuff. And as a matter of fact, the fuel itself is so corrosive that if anybody comes into contact with it, it'll eat their skin, it'll just cancer, just terrible, terrible things. Which is, one of the reasons why in North Korea there's been serious ecological damage because of their missile program. So it's very likely that they are using the devil's venom. Since the Iranians and many other people have been using North Korean technology, they were the ones who were providing nuclear technology to the Syrians for a nuclear power plant, which was knocked out by the Israelis in 2009, or excuse me, 2011. If that was, no, actually 2009, if I remember correctly. But anyway, they knocked it out, and it was a North Korean type of nuclear power plant. And considering the fact that North Korea has been sharing technology of all kinds, whether it's North Korean Kalashnikovs and RPGs that were, shown to be in stocks of Hamas, etc., etc. You can see the North Koreans' fingerprints all over this. So basically, the Israelis have a huge advantage in dealing with the Houthis. First of all, there is pressure on the Houthis, despite all of their bluster, to deal and not cause any more suffering for people who are there. It will be very, very different, of course, with Lebanon. However, you do have one thing that's one constant, and it always seems that whenever you deal with history and you're dealing with the black economy, you're dealing with drugs. In Lebanon, in the Bekaa Valley, Hezbollah is financed largely by opium, the artificial methamphetamine that Hamas was using, and that's why basically they were like Nazi stormtroopers. Those guys were fighting for 2 or 3 days, like the Nazis were during World War II. They didn't have to sleep, they didn't have to drink, they didn't have to eat, and they were capable of the most horrific outrages. And so much of the infrastructure in Hamas, besides lifting funds, skimming it off from legitimate projects, was by selling this methamphetamine. And this is a great part of the income of Syria as well. Now, one drug that is grown in Yemen, which unfortunately has the most arable land on the Arabian Peninsula, is something called gat, which is illegal in many countries. So you have a drug trade or drug trades that are involved in this part of the world. I mean, Somalia is a big part of the economy, Kenya, etc., etc. And so that's kind of a way that I can explain, and I hope it's not too boring, but you really, really need to get into the details of what's going on. The Western media will not give you this kind of analysis, and that's why I'm going up on a platform like Rumble. And hopefully, if you like this, you will help me get this monetized. And I'm not going to either Facebook Live or to YouTube, because frankly, they don't like monetizing this stuff, and they like to make sure that the Google algorithm just wipes you out. So anyway, please do support me. I don't know if I'm going to call this real news, schmooze, and reviews or something like that, but I will be working on this. One of my future projects is actually to interview an author named Bruce Brill, and I'll talk about his book at a later time. Thank you. Bye.